So here's what we're going to do. We're going to level up your Python with object-oriented programming right now. I'm going to show you 3 magic tricks that you can use today to improve your Python code using OOP. The first of these is merging functions into classes, and I'll show you a step-by-step systematic repeatable procedure to do that. We're also going to look at using class methods, and also a feature of Python's object system called magic methods. And I'm going to assume you can write simple classes and methods already, so let's get started. To make it concrete, we're going to work with Python's date class. Usually class names are capitalized, but this one is not. And it's simple. It takes the year, month, and day. You also have time delta. This class represents the difference between 2 points in time. Time delta has a bunch of features, but we're just going to use one. It has an attribute called days. That's the number of days in the interval of time it represents. Okay, let's imagine our program has a few functions for working with dates. The first is simple, count days in range. Give it a start date and an end date, and it returns an int. We can code this in one line. N minus start gives us a time delta in the parentheses, and its days attribute almost gives us the answer. We just need to add 1 to it to include the first day. Here's another called end of week from. Let me explain this one. It takes one argument, which is a date, and what it returns is another date at the end of the 7-day period. So if you feed it a Wednesday, it'll return the date of the next Tuesday. Got that? So the interval between them is going to span 1 full week. Here's the code for it. Pretty simple, but imagine we are using it several places in our program, and we want to make sure no one accidentally adds 7 days instead of 6. So we create this function. Next, we have date in range. This takes 3 arguments, a target date, a start, and an end. This answers a yes or no question. Is this date in this range or not? And this one can also be a one-liner. Again, imagine we're using this several times in our code, and we want to enforce consistency so that no one does a less than when they should be doing less than equal. We protect against errors like that by writing a function. Okay, what do all these have in common? These functions all take start and end date arguments, except for end of week from, but even that one returns the end date, so it's still dealing with start and end. And this is a big clue. You want to look for this. Whenever you see 2 or more functions that have the same argument in common operating on the same object, that means you can combine them into a class. Here's the procedure. First, identify the common argument, or arguments. Probably most of the time, you'll have just one, but in this case, we have 2 arguments in common, start and end. Next, you create a class and give it a constructor that takes those arguments. And in the constructor, you just store them on self. Then you go through each function, one at a time, and you just convert it to a method. I'll show you how to do that in a second. But that's it. Once you've done this, you have a rock-solid class that you can immediately start building on. So let's do this. We're going to call our class dateRange. Now, this constructor takes start and end. These are the common arguments and what we want to store on self. But we check to make sure that the start date is not after the end date. If that's not true, we raise an exception. That's already a big win. None of our functions had this sanity check, but all of the methods will. Let's convert our first function, count days in range. See how it takes start and end and uses them in its body. We want to convert this to use self.start and self.end instead. The first step is to remove those arguments from the signature and of course add self. Then we put in the function body, and everywhere it references start, replace that with self.start, and likewise for end. And we get to make the name shorter. When it was a bare function, the name had to be longer to tell you what it was for. But when you convert it to a method, the class gives context, so you can usually shorten the name. Now, we can't really do this with end of week from, because it only takes a start argument. But step back and look at what it's doing. It's really creating a date range from a given start date. What we really want is to end up with a date range object. That makes sense? So we need a new tool called a class method. A regular method is called off of an instance of a class, but a class method operates off the class itself. Not all languages have this, but it's common in Python. Look at pandas, for example. Data frames have a class method called fromDict. Notice how it's called. Capital data frame dot fromDict. You're calling it directly from the class itself, and it returns an instance of the class. See how this is different? So how do you make a class method? You still use def, but there are several differences. First, you write @class method on the line before the def. This is what Python calls a decorator, and it makes it a class method instead of a regular one. Next, you don't use self. Instead, you use CLS, an argument whose name is those 3 letters. That variable is going to hold the class itself, by the way, because the class method is going to return a new instance of the class. And the way it'll do that is by writing CLS open parenthesis and then the constructor arguments. Okay, that's the high-level overview. Let's see how it actually works. We're going to take the idea of end of week from, reusing its code, because remember, what we really want out of this is a date range object. Whenever you see a function returning an instance of the class, that's a perfect candidate for a class method. So let's create one called week. We'll call it off of the class, passing in a start date only. Here's how you write it. @class method, that's a decorator that says the def on the next line is a class method instead of a regular method. And it takes 2 arguments, CLS and start, but not self. Inside this method, the first thing we need to do is calculate the end date. And to create the instance, CLS is a variable that holds the current class date range. So we can create an instance by writing CLS, open parenthesis, and passing in start and end. You see how this works? The class method is kind of like an alternate constructor, creating an instance in a different way. We have one more function to convert, date in range. This is pretty easy to convert, just like with the count method. We follow the same procedure, and we get to shorten its name too. But we can do better. Python has an in operator, the word in. You can use it to check whether something is in a list or collection. Now imagine, how great will it be to use that with date range? Then we would not need the in range method at all. Turns out you can do this. We can do this with magic methods. These are methods that hook into Python's syntax. For the in operator, the in operator, we define a method called _contains . Notice it takes one argument other than self, called when. That's the date to check, and returns true or false. There are many magic methods like this. Here's a class called money that demonstrates some of them, letting you hook even into arithmetic. Basically, magic methods let your classes work closely with the syntax of Python itself.